Most of us grow up assuming that if you're an American citizen, you get to vote. We treat it as an automatic feature of the system. But historically, that assumption is entirely backwards. Look at this data visualization of the U.S. population in 1789. You wouldn't see universal participation. Instead, you'd see 95% of adults completely stripped away from the polls. Only about 5% of the adult population was legally permitted to cast a ballot. This massive exclusion was intentional. The educated ruling class of the era genuinely believed that elections were best left to wealthy, property-owning white men. John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, summed up the philosophy perfectly. The people who own the country ought to govern it. The Constitution left the exact time, place, and manner of elections up to individual state legislatures. The history of voting is the story of that excluded 95% systematically dismantling the legal arguments designed against them. The earliest of those barriers was purely economic. To cast a ballot in early America, state legislatures explicitly required voters to be white men who either owned property or paid taxes. Sometimes they even had to belong to a dominant religious group. The rationale was that men with financial stakes and formal education would make wiser, more calculated political choices than the working class, who didn't own land. Over the first half of the 1800s, working-class citizens pushed back against these economic restrictions, arguing they were undemocratic. Slowly, state legislatures gave in. They formally abolished the property requirements, and soon after, the religious restrictions fell as well. By the mid-1800s, the country achieved nearly complete adult white male suffrage. The ruling class's strict definition of a qualified citizen had been successfully rewritten to include the working class. But rewriting the rules for white men was very different from breaking the gender barrier in the 20th century. Earning the vote for women required an aggressive confrontation with deeply ingrained cultural norms across the entire country. Suffragists organized intensely. Leaders like Alice Paul, a founder of the National Women's Party, pushed the movement beyond polite lobbying. Her group staged hunger strikes, they held public vigils, they even practiced civil disobedience by unlawfully registering to vote, forcing the system to arrest them. When World War I broke out, they strategically weaponized the conflict. Suffragists picketed outside the White House, holding massive banners to expose a glaring hypocrisy. America was fighting a war for democracy overseas, while simultaneously denying 20 million women the right to vote at home. This sustained, highly visible public disruption worked. It generated the momentum needed to ratify the 19th Amendment after the war, putting nationwide suffrage for women into effect. Following the Civil War, the 15th Amendment explicitly prohibited states from taking away a citizen's right to vote based on race. But getting a right on paper and actually casting a ballot are two very different things. What followed was a decades-long legal maze designed by state governments to systematically exclude African Americans. Look at how this flowchart illustrates the mechanics of the grandfather clause. Southern political leaders wrote this rule to automatically exempt voters whose grandfathers had voted before 1867. Because the grandfathers of most African Americans living in the South had been enslaved, this rule cleanly routed white voters straight to the ballot, while trapping African American voters in a maze of bureaucratic hurdles. One of those hurdles was the poll tax. Voters had to pay a fee months before Election Day, and they had to pay it for the current year as well as any previous unpaid years. For poor and minority citizens, this compounding tax created an immense financial burden. States then combined this financial barrier with a literacy test, but officials rarely just asked African American voters to prove they could read. They weaponized the test, requiring them to explain highly complicated, obscure parts of the state or national constitution. It took until the civil rights movement of the 1960s to break this institutional lock. Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, authorizing the federal government to bypass local jurisdictions entirely. Federal poll watchers were sent in, literacy tests were abolished, and the national government began registering voters directly. The decades of discrimination proved a vital lesson about democracy. A constitutional right printed on paper offers no real protection without aggressive federal mechanisms to enforce it against local loopholes. Around the same time, the Vietnam War brought the final major historical barrier into sharp focus: the voting age. For years, the minimum voting age in most states was 21, but in the 1960s, millions of 18-year-old men were being drafted to fight in Southeast Asia. They were deemed mature enough to be forced into military service, yet legally denied a political voice to vote on the leaders sending them to war. This unavoidable paradox accelerated the youth suffrage movement. The pressure resulted in the rapid 1971 ratification of the 26th Amendment, lowering the voting age to 18 everywhere and instantly enfranchising more than 10 million young citizens. Lowering the voting age cemented a clear principle. If the state requires you to perform extreme obligations, like military service, you inherently demand democratic representation in return. Today's American electorate looks nothing like the isolated 5% of 1789. Property laws, poll taxes, and literacy tests have been entirely eradicated to achieve universal adult suffrage. But the mechanics of restrictions still exist. In a 2013 case, Shelby County v. Holder, the Supreme Court ruled that the formula used to decide which states required federal oversight was unconstitutional. This decision removed the requirement for states with a history of discrimination to pre-clear their voting laws with the federal government. Without strict federal review, more subtle forms of restriction evolved. Take a look at this abstract map displaying the mechanics of gerrymandering. State legislatures redraw their district boundaries to pack minority voters into a single area or crack them apart, strategically slicing them across multiple districts so they never form a majority bloc. The history of voting rights shows us that the ballot isn't a static object that was permanently won by previous generations. It is a vulnerable, living mechanism, and it requires constant vigilance, maintenance, and public participation to actually survive.